Tuesday, August 28th, study session for the Littleton City Council, and we have everyone in attendance except for Mayor Pro Tem Valdez. First item on the agenda is the priority-based budgeting review, and I think we have Tiffany Uden and Chris Fabian to present that. You guys want to go ahead and start?
Sure. Good evening, Council. It's good to have you here tonight. We're talking about priority-based budgeting. Just want to give you a couple of points as reminders. We did talk to you about this in January of 2018. If you remember, I did say that this would be an exhilarating project, and it has far surpassed that. It definitely has its perks, and it has its opportunities as well. So I just wanted to kind of remind you that we talked about this. We've gone through the majority of the priority-based budgeting process with departments, and we're having a recap tonight to kind of tell you where we are and where we're headed with that. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris Fabian, who is the founder of Priority-Based Budgeting, and we have a number of slides that we provided to you prior to this evening, so we'll quickly run through those and then we'll leave some time for questions.
Sounds great. Thanks everybody. I remember most of you, but it's been a while since you've seen me, and I'm sure you have many visitors, but my name is Chris Fabian, and I was part of the team to lead your priority-based budgeting effort. Tonight, the presentation, my intention is to give you a taste of what's to come. You've gone through the implementation of priority-based budgeting, and now comes the fun part, taking action on the data that you've put together. And so my goal in a brief period of time together is to go through some discussion of how other communities start to put their data to use, in hopes that by sharing some of their stories, it will plant the seed in your mind for how you can start to ask questions about your own information. If there's one other point, it's that priority-based budgeting has been described as a cultural change initiative. It's not like turning on a light switch and all of a sudden your organization changes overnight. This will take some time to start to get into the practice of asking questions about programs based on what you've learned and based on the data that you have. It'll take time for you as elected officials. It'll take time for departments. In fact, departments are right now kind of finalizing some of the very last cleanup of their program inventories and costs. I just wanted to make that point because what you have done actually exceptionally well to implement in the time frame that you implemented within. So your staff is to be congratulated for that. Many of our communities, Randy can attest from his experiences in Parker, take a lot longer, many months longer than you to implement PBB, which is exceptional that you're able to. We'll move into this planting the seed session of how to take action on the data. And then lastly, I'll turn it back over to Tiffany to talk about some really immediate near-term steps for how you're going to use PBB in this budget cycle. Project recap, I have a toggle to the actual internet here. I wanted to share with you that what staff went through as a reminder, without diving too far into the weeds. You came up with what we call a program inventory, which is a list of every service provided across the city. Staff then took the line item budget that you're probably familiar with, so every personnel line item, salaries, benefits, overtime, every non-personnel line item, supplies and services and materials and memberships and dues. They took that line item budget and allocated it to all of the programs that you identified. Why would you do that? Well, one of the reasons is because now you can go through and actually scan every program that you provide, this being just a quick example within the tools, and drill into any particular program, for example, like snow removal, and find out exactly what it costs overall, the breakdown of the personnel costs of snow removal versus the non-personnel costs of snow removal, and if we wanted to drill into it even further to see how did we come up with those personnel costs. It was staff actually allocating every employee in this organization based on the time that they spend providing a program such as this. So this is what you did. This is what you didn't have necessarily before. So anytime a question comes up, how much do we spend on snow removal? How much do we spend on street sweeping? That's the kind of information that is actually right in front of you. Just as a pop quiz, I was going to ask, does anybody have a guess what you spend on street sweeping?
$273,000.
Holy smokes, are you serious?
I was going to say 270.
It's $273,000.
Wait, seriously?
530.
Yeah.
This is one of those moments.
Did you tell him?
That was not even a plan.
No, that was not.
This is one of those things where you do think like we are definitely living in the Matrix. So that was
Well, I'm done here.
Gotta go to Vegas.
Vegas, here I come.
all right. To really test your knowledge, how about elf days? How much do you spend on that?
Elf day?
Elf crawl.
Elf crawl.
$30,287. And we can break those down by personnel and non-personnel. So when you have these types of questions, this is what you're going to want to dive into. That was actually quite astounding. That's like a mystery that we'll have to figure out later.
I sent him the number prior to. No, I
It's amazing. Lastly, within this intro discussion, every program was evaluated based on its influence on the results that matter to this community, providing for a safer society, a healthy economy, actually the specific results that are Littleton's. Furthermore, programs were evaluated based on whether they were mandated or not, the degree to which they're mandated, cost recovery, size of population served, and so on, such that we could come up with an initial rank order of programs based on relevance. As part of the hallmark of PBB is to come to an understanding within any department, what are the programs that really influence what you're trying to achieve is differentiated from programs that have less to do with what you're trying to achieve. And why do we do that? Because as departments start to make recommendations on ways that they might reallocate their own resources to bolster other programs or to start new programs, they might come to you with a recommendation to say, we're going to take resources out of a lower priority program in order to reallocate them to a higher priority program, and that becomes the framework for budget recommendations. As a high-level overview, again, not diving too far into this, I did want to share with you your spending array by quartile, a reminder that quartile 1 and quartile 2 are the highest priorities. Those are programs that scored the highest. They have the most to do with achieving results. They scored high with those categories such as degree of mandate, cost recovery, size of population served, and so on. Is differentiated from quartile 3 and ultimately quartile 4 programs, which beg the question as the departments begin to review their data, how might we use these resources differently? So your spending array is actually extremely healthy. What we want as a first cut is the majority of your resources going to Q1 and Q2, quartile 1, quartile 2. It reflects something you probably would have guessed, maybe not as precisely as what you guessed, that you have been prioritizing. Of course you have. You are well aware of the results that matter most to your citizens, and you put resources towards those programs that impact those results. That's what it means to, if I would have been showing you an array that had all of your resources in quartile 4, I'd say, wow, you might know what your results are, but you seem to keep funding these things that have nothing to do with your results. That's not the picture that you're looking at. So this reflects very positively. It's like a first look in the mirror. Over time, what you hope happens is that as departments make recommendations, you start to channel resources away from lower priority program areas and push those resources towards higher priorities. So you always have a starting place to look back on.
And I will just add to that. He mentioned first cut, so I just want you to be aware that this is definitely raw data. We have not made it precise. We're still reviewing results. We're still reviewing programs. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we go through, and he kind of shows you these little excerpts from the program.
Very good. So with that in mind, a basic understanding of the type of data that you have, giving you a roadmap ahead or a blueprint, I wanted to spend a little bit of time describing how communities start to ask questions about this information, to train you as elected officials how to really put this to use. First and foremost, I think it's really important to realize priority-based budgeting is just a tool. It's a way of getting the data that you need, presumably, to start to handle a more fundamental question. The question is, elected officials or city leaders, as you see over there on the left-hand side, as you look out towards the future, it's probably not hard to imagine that you have new programs you would love to start that would matter to this community, new things that are going to positively change this community. You might have programs that you offer today that are going to require more resources. Maybe street sweeping needs more than $273,000 to really do a great job. And the hard part is we don't have infinite resources. You don't have just this money sitting to the side that you can start all of these new programs. And that is why you use PVB to begin to understand you have two basic levers to free up the resources you need to go and tackle those new programs of tomorrow or enhance the programs you wish to get into. You can look at what you're currently spending money on, the expense side of the equation, and question, might we be able to use those resources differently? Can we free them up and allocate them to other programs? Or we can look at the revenue side of the equation, which includes actually generating new sources of revenue through fees for service, grants, charges for service, and so on, to fund new programs as well. And so what priority-based budgeting does is tries to frame the conversation around those two levers, freeing up resources to reallocate or generating new revenue to start new programs overall. And I'm not going to go through each of these sections in extraordinary detail, but I think it's helpful that if you walk away knowing, well, we have two levers, and we should always ask, can we free up resources from this program, work on the expense side, or can we generate new revenues in order to provide programs of tomorrow as well? But I do want to spend a little time going through some examples. And I'll start on the revenue side. So when you think about bringing new money into the organization, certainly the taxation question could come up, but we don't start there. It's kind of like the last resort because it is ultimately something you put towards the voters, and it's a little out of your control. So we start with programs that might bring in fees for service already and ask the question, are the fees covering the costs of the program? And that's not to say that every program that charges a fee should always be at 100% cost recovery. For good reason, you might decide it's wise to subsidize a program overall. Those are policy questions. The purpose of the data is to at least bring the programs in front of you to say, well, have we considered raising the fees for a while? Or do we know that we're not recovering all of our costs? So quick example along these lines, this was Branson, Missouri. One of their programs was the removal of trees from residential property. And they subsidized the program entirely. So if you're a resident in Branson and you want a tree removed from your yard, you can call up the city and they'll come out and they'll take that tree away and they'll chop it up and it's free. Well, it's not free. You pay taxes for that. You don't have to pay additionally. So this is a picture, and as you can see, this is the kind of data that you can ask of any program that you offer. This program is funded entirely by what we call general government resources. It's subsidized as opposed to program revenue, which is a term in PVB, which means fees or charges for service. The fees and charges for service are here at zero. And the question that Branson was asking was, well, might it be something we want to consider to actually remove the subsidization and charge only the users for that program overall? That of the few people who actually want trees removed, maybe we charge a fee, and then we free up the other resources to get into other programs like fighting opioids or fixing potholes or wherever they need to start. What's kind of interesting is that becomes one logical way that you might tackle the issue. Another is that here in where I live, just down the street in Denver, the program costs look something like this, where there are no costs to the city, and that's because nobody does this in the city of Denver. They don't offer this program. If I want a tree removed from my property and I call the city, they say we don't actually provide this. We're not in that business. So this is a picture of my father-in-law, and when I want a tree removed, that's who I call to actually have this program provided. But there's a lesson to be learned here. As you look at programs, you have options. You can decide, is it wise to use the general taxpayer dollars to fund it? Should we charge a fee for those who use it? Or should we remain in this business at all? Is it our role? Just one thing overall to keep in mind, we scanned the entire priority-based budgeting database of communities who have implemented, and by and large we find out that for every community we work with, there's about a 16% gap just for those programs that charge a fee already, where the cost of providing those programs is higher than the fees coming in. It's not good, it's not bad, it just represents an opportunity. So as you consider programs, your own residential tree removal, you actually have a program. It pays for itself and then some. It's the sale of trees. It's about a $5,000 program in your database, bringing in about $10,000 for what it's worth. Next part of the conversation, again on the revenue side, we focus on a really intriguing opportunity, and that is selling services to other entities, other organizations. So it's not just the fee and charges side of the discussion. It's asking a question around sourcing of programs. Might you be really well positioned to in-source services and actually get paid for providing a program on a regional basis? My example here, Inglewood does this when it comes to fleet services. If you didn't know this already, Inglewood has a centralized garage that provides fleet services to Sheridan, to Cherry Hills Village, and to the Inglewood School District. So all of those entities, Sheridan, Cherry Hills Village, and Inglewood Schools, they don't provide their own internal fleet. Instead, they outsource it to the City of Inglewood. City of Inglewood is well positioned to provide that service to multiple entities, and they charge money for that. This only works if for the other entities it's cheaper for them to just pay the other service provider, and for Inglewood, the workload that they have to increase to provide the enhanced level of service, they make money on it by generating the revenue. So it's a win-win for everybody involved. We've had a lot of experiences with this recently. In fact, we're really excited. Mark and Eric Keck from Inglewood and staff, we're going to get together in a couple weeks, and because Inglewood has gone through this process as well, priority-based budgeting, they're going to share all of their data with the City of Littleton, looking for these opportunities where, from Mark's perspective, Littleton is asking itself, maybe we're Inglewood Fleet. Maybe we are well positioned to provide a service to Inglewood and in-source it. And from Eric Keck's perspective at Inglewood, he would say, fantastic, it's cheaper for me to just pay you. And I know Eric already has a number of ideas he's excited to pitch to you.
That's what I'm afraid of.
It's very true. So we consider the overall magnitude. This is just, again, kind of big picture from the PBB community. What we find is that roughly 41% of your budget, compared to other communities, represents programs that are kind of ripe for this discussion. That they're high priority to you, the quartile 1 or quartile 2, and other local entities are also providing this program. So it begs the question, can we at least put it on the table to see if insourcing for revenue generation is actually a really good idea? But to Mark's point, there's a flip side to the coin. So we're just talking about insourcing to provide regionally, becoming kind of entrepreneurial to see can you sell services for revenue generation. And I should just add really quickly, this doesn't stop at public sector to public sector. We were in Shawnee, Kansas just 2 weeks ago, and they're looking at ways that they can serve other nonprofits in their community. If you think about a lot of small businesses, nonprofits who don't have the infrastructure to actually have their own fleet, to mow their own grounds, and so on, they would love to have the opportunity to take advantage of a city service provider where it makes sense. But again, the other side of the coin is, what programs do you offer today where you might look to other entities and actually advantageously outsource? So Mark is going to be looking at Eric to ask the exact opposite question. Are there programs that Inglewood is really well positioned to provide that if Littleton got out of the business of providing tree removal or what have you, then Littleton can free up its own resources and with that capacity start new programs that you wish to get into. So I think hopefully the concept is making sense. Toledo is doing this right now on a pretty massive scale, actually involving the private sector. So just stretching your imagination, they partner with their Chamber of Commerce, and they take a program here like street sweeping, where to the city of Toledo, they have felt like, oh, it's a really high priority program. We want to make sure that it gets done right. But as they started to talk with other local businesses in Toledo, they found there's a lot of businesses who are capable of doing street sweeping very well. The city is not relied upon to provide that service alone, and perhaps they can free up some of their own resources by advantageously, outsourcing. Moffat County did this exact same exercise. Little Moffat County, believe it or not, there's not too many service providers up there. And as they were looking at some of the opportunities that even in their own region, the local hospital looked to Moffat County and said, wow, we had no idea half the services that you provided. In fact, as they scanned the program inventory, the hospital looked to Moffat County and asked, do you really provide laundry services? It was in their program inventory. And the county administrator or finance director said, yeah, we have a pretty substantial laundry facility for our jail and another for our nursing home. And the hospital said, wow, that's shocking. We just didn't realize that was the case, because today we actually ship our laundry 2.5 hours to Grand Junction. We spend several $100,000 just assuming that there was no laundry provider here locally. So what does that mean? From the hospital's perspective, they're going to outsource to Moffat County, form a partnership. From Moffat County's perspective, it's an insourcing opportunity to make some money. So that's win-win. Overall, as Moffat County went through this analysis, they found 59% of their budget was represented in programs that others provide that are at least on the table for this type of discussion overall. So that's the idea behind outsourcing. We found that on average, 60, this is not surprising probably, but just data across all of our communities, approximately 60% of PVB implementers' budgets are tied up in programs that are offered by others, and again, at least on the table to discuss. It might be advantageous if you allowed another service provider to provide it, allowing you to free up some percentage of that 60%. That's a lot of money, and hopefully it would add up to opportunity. A couple other quick examples. So rounding out the expense side, another thing that PVB implementers get into is studying program efficiencies. Why do you study efficiencies? Because if you can do the program for less, you can free up resources to do other things. Everything always comes back to that. So just like a couple of examples that will stick in your mind, it's a mindset thing. There used to be a program, this is true apparently in the 1900s, where someone would go around and knock on people's windows to wake them up before we had alarm clocks. They were called knocker-ups, and they were paid, and this was a job that somebody had. You fast forward a little bit of time, and we had lamp lighters before we had electrified cities. This was someone's job to go around and light the lamps. And now we look back on these programs, and they're laughable because we say, geez, we used to have to pay people. We used to have to deploy financial resources and hire human resources to do these jobs. And now we're sort of thankful that we don't have human beings lighting the lamps, that we can redeploy them to do other things like working on a safer society or becoming police officers, putting out fires, whatever we need to do. And so I just urge you, as you look at your own programs for efficiencies, as you look at maybe automation or technology, the role that it can play, consider for any program that you provide, what will be your version of the lamplighter? What will be your version of the knocker-ups? And we have tons of fascinating examples as you go through this. One that comes up again and again is water meter reading in utilities, where today there's a mix of cities who do it manually versus a mix of cities who have been able to automate that. And it's really not controversial. It's just, are we able to deploy a technology solution in order to free up our staff members and reallocate them to other programs? Can technology be helpful to us in that case? And that's the type of analysis we want you to go through on the program efficiency side. And then finally, as it comes to service levels, there will be certain programs, again, this is part of the point of prioritizing, that end up having less relevance to results. They might be quartile 4. And the question on the table is, if we can't charge a fee for it, if we can't strategically outsource the program, if we can't just simply make it more efficient, are there some programs where it just makes sense to do less of the program in order to redeploy resources to do more of something else? And as I get into this, the theme of this area, you think about the role of government and what you were tasked with, and you have so many needs, and a philosophy that you might consider. This is from a book called What's the Future, and it's talking about the role of government in the future. They say government really needs to be concerned with what only government can do, because nobody else is going to take up that challenge. And in order to do that, it's really hard. It means you have to try to find ways to get out of the business of other things when you have resource scarcity, when you don't have infinite resources overall. So in your data, and this is what the departments will begin to work on, every human being can see where their time is actually allocated. And so down to an individual position, they can see their own quartile 4 percentage of time allocation and consider how they might free up their own resources to get into higher level programs and a greater contribution overall. This is just one example of an employee in Washington County, Wisconsin, who on the one hand was named 40 under 40 in her community for significant contributions and great leadership. when it came to how the county was using her, was almost entirely dedicated to quartile 3 and quartile 4 programs. So here's a very talented human resource. We always talk about our greatest assets are human resources, where their next goal is to find out how can they redeploy her resources to become more aligned with new programs that they want to get into. How does that work? It requires lessening service levels that she's providing, in this case, to get into other higher priority pursuits. With that in mind, I have one last section, and I'm sorry, I know I'm pressing. All I was going to close with is a segue into Tiffany's next part of the presentation. We can talk about the right side of the blueprint and how to free up resources and how to generate revenue, but the left side is also really important. It's crucial for council as well to talk about where do we start. And as I turn it over to Tiffany, the question of what are the new programs we need to get into, what are the programs that need enhancement, it's identifying the new needs where you need resources and don't have them today that really put into context why you need to free up resources or generate revenue on the other side of the equation. And as we talked about, Envision, Littleton Vision, it's a classic example, something coming up, of an exercise, an initiative, where you're going to spend a lot of time talking about what new things are actually needed overall. So as we transition into more of the near term, and I'll pull up your slide, this is what you can expect coming up here. Okay.
So I think for council, that was kind of a high-level, brief overview of where we are today. And like he said, we've gone through identifying programs, we've gone through cost allocations, and we've gone through evaluating those both internally with the departments and as a peer group. The one thing that I did mention earlier is that we are still refining the data. We have to go back, we have to review it, we have to look for anomalies, and go back and visit with departments. So, like he mentioned earlier, we were really pressed for time, and we had a strict timeline and a short timeline to get to where we are today. And I think that kind of came with the fact that we did have to kind of slow down the process a little bit to give departments enough time to review their programs and evaluate and look at their prioritizations. And so what we're looking towards in the future is the Envision Littleton is going to have a great impact on where we are with PBB. Talking about what the vision of the city and where the city is going is definitely going to potentially change the goals and the priorities of council. And so we want to incorporate that. And I know that's going to be discussed in January. So we're going to have to incorporate those changes that come out of the Envision Littleton process. And then the other thing is the council retreat. New priorities are going to be reviewed and discussed, and so that again will align with the PBB process. One thing that we're looking at doing over the next year before the 2020 budget process is we're going to work with our departments, and we're going to ask them to review 3 programs that they've identified through this process and kind of evaluate them and look at them and wholeheartedly and offer some ideas and some points to not only management but also to council over the next year, and so that we can really look at those programs that we've identified to see if there are ways that we can reallocate resources. The other thing that we envision is through this review of these programs, and 3 is a minimum, you know, if departments want to do more, fabulous. I think 3 is plenty with everything else that departments have to do over this next year. But that will definitely come towards council next year, potentially in the 2020 budget process as a support to a policy question, potentially. So if a department wants to enhance a program, we'll have data from the PBB to support why the city and the citizens need that additional support for that. And so with that kind of gives you an idea of where we're headed. I do want to, again, just mention that this is typically a 3-year process. We kind of talked about that when we started this program. We're definitely ahead of the curve for the first year, but we're definitely not where we want to be or where we need to be to make some good, hard, fast decisions. And so we're asking, you know, let us refine the data, let us get into the 2020 budget. You'll definitely see support from the PBB program, and then year 2021 is definitely the year that you will absolutely see kind of the fruits of the labor of the PBB process and how that can support decisions and policy decisions that council is going to be faced with in that year. So,
How many departments do we have?
14? Sure.
Now, what do you say?
Kyle, you have a good choice. You have a
There
good
could be
guess.
potentially 45 ideas out there somewhere in that
Potentially,
vicinity.
yes. And they could be small programs, they could be large programs. We're going to kind of leave that up to the departments to decide which ones they want to look at. We'll probably have some suggestions from the city manager's office and maybe from finance.
Yes, we will.
As what programs we want departments to look at. But yes, there potentially could be that many.
And once it comes back to council, I mean, this isn't something that has to go out to the public. This is something council can vote on, I assume. As far as,
We would envision it to be during the budget process each year. So when a program is identified that we want to enhance it or reduce it and maybe reallocate resources, then it would come through the budget process. But the Envision Littleton and the council retreat is a time when citizens can definitely talk about it if they'd like to, or offer any ideas or suggestions at that time.
Other questions, Karina?
I really love this. The one item that I didn't see in the efficiencies, that you talk about efficiencies gained through technology, but there are efficiency gained through just looking at our current processes with what we're doing now, and where is there redundancy or non-value added steps. So I think there's a lot that we can probably look at now that doesn't have the cost of technology or either the financial cost or the time cost of implementing technology. So is that so was it not included because
So
tell
I
me-
can fit it into a smaller
Yeah.
period of time.
I think that's inherent in the process of PBB, and also we have a number of employees who have gone through the peak black belt through the city and county of Denver, and so we actually look at processes throughout each year. We're in depth right now in one related to contracts and purchase orders. So we are doing that currently with a group of people and taking advantage of the experience that those people have with that academy.
I was going to simply, this was in that section, but I actually skipped over it for the sake of time. As it comes, whether it's technology or just as you described, programs that we're not talking about technology and just process improvement. I had an example in Clear Creek County as they're looking across their own organization at all permitting tasks that take place in various departments. For the first time, it was really clear to them, wow, all these different departments are involved in similar processes. What can we learn from one another? Should we centralize it? Are there advantages there? So now that you have programs identified, you can look internally. At some point, you can also look externally to see for any type of program, how does it compare to others who have gone through this work, like Littleton and Inglewood, or what you can learn from one another. How do building inspections work in Inglewood versus how do they work in Littleton? And is any city tremendously more efficient for the same type of workload? You have some of that data to begin those comparisons overall. But you're exactly right.
And I think one thing that we did find as we were looking at programs across the departments is there are programs that are being done in multiple departments, and so there's the opportunity to discuss with those departments, is there a way we can make this more efficient across the city?
And while you have said that you'll bring it forward in the 2020 budget process, are you aware of or see that there are already some opportunities that you're going to bring forward for 2019 that are just obvious that you may want to consider bringing forward for 2019?
Well, I think, a couple thoughts. One that I've mentioned before is that we are in a pretty deep process review of our community development process. So that's a combination of community development and public works, fire, I guess, as well in that. So we are, in fact, we have a detailed presentation scheduled in October. So you will see some recommendations that come out that will influence likely, a budget in the future. But based on where we're at with the priority-based budgeting, we really are not in a position here to make very specific recommendations when we meet here in a couple of weeks. The data is just not polished enough for us to kind of deeply review that and make a recommendation. it's going to take us another year to really be in that place. However, that's why we are on a plan here where we're going to work with departments to select 3 programs to run through this blueprint process so that we can make changes here, maybe sooner than 2020, but certainly to influence the 2020 budget process. And I might just take just a minute here. I got to acknowledge the fact that Tiffany and all of our department directors, all of our staff went through an amazing process in a very short order to get this in place. And I couldn't be more thrilled. I truly am. And I've seen the output of this and how it can affect an organization. So when Chris says that this is a cultural change, it is a cultural change. It starts a conversation at a completely different level, not just between the staff and the council, but the staff themselves. And I think this is an amazing tool for us, and I've told the staff to tell your story. How do you do your work? Because it's hard for me, for council to see it at our level. But those who are on the front line, this is an amazing tool to tell that. One last piece there that Chris touched on, and I think probably one of my probably most notable pieces I took away from a process like this is establishing service levels. When you start identifying, take snowplowing as an example, the cost that we've got is for this particular service level. So when we get this much snow on the ground, that's when we deploy. Well, quite honestly, cities aren't used to having that conversation with their council. So is that what council wants for a service level? Do you want it higher or do you want it lower? And that's exactly the conversation I had on that very specific program in the city I was in. They decided to raise the level of service. And so it was just a great way to kind of frame the conversation and for us to be a little more precise about the true cost of a service. So that's a long way to answer that question, but I think we're just not quite in a position here to make very formal recommendations using this data for 2019.
Other questions?
I can see where this really empowers our staff, it really gets them more engaged and lets their voice be heard a little bit more too.
That's the cultural change.
Great.
Yeah, and I think the other piece we haven't talked about is eventually I want to get to kind of an outward-facing piece of this for the public to see. So, that's in the future here. I don't know when, but we got to perfect the data first.
I think one of the benefits of this is that it really goes in there and it just starts tearing it all apart and down to the the smallest little thread, the smallest little detail, and specifically for staff because council doesn't need to go that deep. But for staff to do that because it is day to day, it's just every day you do that and you do the same thing and you do the same work and then next month these are the things that we do this month and then the spring comes and these are the things we do in the spring and to be able to just take all that apart and really look at that fine detail. I think that you guys are going to be able to make some really good recommendations back to us, which will obviously enable us to make better decisions, not just, and then we'll have the community input that we can obviously apply to that, but some of the stuff that is just, we do it because we've always done it, and changing things and doing things differently, and just the fact how much shifting there is in cities. Mark and I were talking about this the other day. The sourcing out of work is becoming a bigger and bigger and bigger deal. I think cities, staffs will, over time, become smaller, and the trades that serve cities will grow because there's an efficiency in that, and part of it is because you can share across boundaries, and there's also, as we can tell with fire, the benefit of not having to support that type of a department and what that can do to a budget. So I think it's good stuff. It's interesting. We'll just get our feet wet this time, but I think that as we go through 2019 with this, continue updates and working through it so that when we do hit budget season, we've got a really good idea of what's going on and it brought us along the way because there's going to be some tough decisions about programs. So, and there should be.
And also, as we're looking at our fee structure, so is that number one on this list for a real really evaluating it, the
I was
cost.
anticipating somebody from council picking up on that one. So actually, that is a good example where we are looking at that here for the 29 budget. Remember last year, yeah, 2019, what did I say? Okay, anyways. So yes, it's the question, we do have kind of a cost of service study that we've been performing on the development review piece, so that will influence the 2019 budget. So you will see that on September 11th and 12th.
Excellent, thank you so much, appreciate it.
Thank you.
So the next time we'll talk about this will be in our retreat?
September.
Or, did I miss that?
Yes, actually, we will talk about this under retreat in January. I talked with the mayor briefly about this. I haven't talked to the rest of council, but I'd like to try to assemble council at the end of January.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Hey, Chris, good job.
Yeah, I do have a question. We used to have, and maybe still do, an employee incentive program. So maybe we hire somebody who just happens to have had experience doing something and he's an idea. And maybe he's just a really creative person and has been doing something and suddenly has an idea of how to do it cheaper, better, etc. Do we still have an incentive program?
I don't remember, to be honest. It sounds familiar, but I can't confirm that. But I'd be happy to kind of research that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you don't know about it, then maybe we don't. And it seems to me, at least we let employees know, if you got a really good idea, don't, come forward with it, right? Maybe it'll go someplace, maybe it won't, but maybe it really will. And it might be something then that is good enough that we get to make money off of it by serving some other cities, or at least reduce our cost of implementation and whatever.
I have some great stories around that particular topic, but I'll save them for
Thank
another
you.
time. You're welcome, Mayor.
Thank you. So we'll move right to our amendments regarding short-term rentals in the Title 10 zoning change and city attorney tasks. Where's that take?
Do you want to drive or you want to?
Sure.
That was our chance to sneak out.
So,
She was.
Mayor, Council, this is the second item, which is to discuss in general terms a draft ordinance on short-term rentals. As you'll recall, at the last study session, you gave us direction on a number of policy questions. And so based on that direction, we prepared a draft ordinance on short-term rentals. And what you had said to us, you said, prepare the draft ordinance. Based on that direction, made plans to bring it forward both to the Planning Commission, engage public outreach, and then time this so that it comes back to council prior to the end of the moratorium on October 17th of 2018. And so with that, we are back tonight to talk about the draft ordinance itself. And we had three objectives. I have been talking all week, and so if I lose my voice, I'm just going to fix it for me. But we had three objectives. One was to look at a formalized process for addressing short-term rentals. One was how do we maintain community character and making sure that these do not become a detriment to neighborhoods and part of the community. And how do we ensure public safety? And part of that ensuring public safety is enforcement. So let's get to the formalized process. Now, there's actually two different sides of this. One is the business license. Now, the business, we call it a business and use license. It's really a sales tax license. And I've had the question asked, well, we charge sales tax on retail sales. These aren't retail sales. Well, one of the categories in the sales tax code is sales tax on lodging services, which is lodging for a period of no longer than 30 days. And that is subject to the city's sales tax. There's actually 26 different categories of items subject to the city's sales tax. We tend to think of it as always retail, but lodging services is one of those that's subject. Now, one of the things that we took from the council's direction at the prior study session was to look at an actual license. And this would not be the same as a zoning case. This would be an over-the-counter license done through the Community Services Department. And they would have a series of standards which are included in the draft ordinance for this short-term rental operator's license. And we would include all types of short-term rentals. Some short-term rentals are just renting a couple of weeks of a house. Some are renting an entire house. Some are even, in some cases, renting an accessory house. And all of those would be included. And we have, as we mentioned previously, 10 current licensees. Those licensees would be given until January 1 of 2020 to come into compliance with the new licensing requirement. And some have asked, well, why would you give that long? Well, we don't expect, as council directs otherwise, to be through this process until the end of October. We would then normally do notifications and we would do a public information campaign, so to speak, of making sure people were aware of the licensing requirements. And this gives those people who are in compliance roughly a year to get through that process. Certainly, if council thought it should be sooner, it could be.
Up there we have 20, we have 50. We just got through talking priority based. Wouldn't it cost more to process paperwork than $20?
Well,
I mean, are these fees realistic?
it could be more. One of the things we're doing is we're doing a cost of service study. And so right now, rather than setting fees that could be too high, we set fees at a level at this point in time that we thought were, it covers more than the current fee, because right now the current fee for business licenses in all categories is zero. But that will be one of the things we will have to determine through the budget processes. Are these fees realistic? Right now, we could not tell you that they are, but we also can't really tell you that they're not. And so that goal would be over that next year, we would have information that we could come to you through the budget process and say, yes, these fees are realistic, or no, we were off and we need to adjust those.
Thank you.
Now, the second part of this is really maintaining community character. And we would allow these in all zoning districts with a residential use. They'd have to go through the licensing process. It would have to be a primary residence of the licensee, and they would have to meet building code occupancy limits. So what does that mean? Right now, in the International Property Maintenance Code, a residence is required to have 150 square feet per person. So if you had a 1,500 square foot house, you could have 10 people in the house. And that would still be the same here. You couldn't do a short-term rental and be exempt from the occupancy limits. You'd be subject to those limits. And you would finally have to provide parking for the individuals renting the house. One of the concerns that we've had in the past when we've had short-term rentals has been that parking ended up on the street. And one of the requirements of the license would be that you would have to address parking for the renters. And
On your property.
On your property. And those are all designed to, again, maintain this community character. What we don't want is short-term rentals suddenly detracting from neighborhoods. What we want to is a regulatory process that, yes, we recognize private property rights. Yes, we recognize that this has become a major business There was an article in the Denver Business News today where Denver estimates that there's over $112 million a year in short-term rentals in the city of Denver, and that's just a portion that they believe are in compliance. So this has become there's no question, this has become a huge economic engine. And then finally, rules to ensure public safety. One, that those who rent these homes, they have to provide the licensees, the people who rent, copies of the city's noise, parking, and trash regulations. Many times, people maybe do not comply with requirements because they simply don't know. And you'd say, well, people should know. Well, different cities have different rules on noise. Some cities say noise has to stop at 10. Others say it has to stop at midnight. If you don't have that information, you might not know. And so this is a way of making sure that the people who rent those homes know what the rules are. And Councilmember, yes?
So will the people who are occupying receive a copy?
They would receive a copy of this, that's correct. And the owners of these homes would have to have a local contact. One of the concerns that we have is that when these homes are rented, in many places, Airbnbs and short-term rentals of any kind have become a business. And you could have an absentee owner in San Francisco renting homes in Littleton. The problem with that is, how do we get in touch with them? And generally, I can tell you somebody in San Francisco might not be terribly concerned about a noise complaint in Littleton. So we want a local contact, someone that we can go to and say, hey, we have a problem, you need to take care of it.
Question for this. We don't have that with other businesses though, right?
We generally don't have that with other businesses.
Generally, or we do?
We generally don't. I mean, I would imagine, like medical marijuana, we would have an ability to find a licensee. Usually, liquor licensees, again, you may own a restaurant that has a liquor license, but you're going to have a designated manager that we can go to, or you could risk losing your license. So
this isn't something new?
This isn't something new. It's just the nature of this business. We would suggest from a staff standpoint, this is appropriate because it's a situation where we need to have a local contact versus having a business where we can't find anybody to address the problem.
Is it for the local contact, is that on the license or is that for the renter to contact someone?
It would be on the license. It would be then whoever holds the license. If I hold the license, there needs to be a local contact. I have to have a local contact that can be reached even if I can't be reached. It may be my primary residence, but what happens if I'm out of town? What happens if I'm not available? There needs to be someone else that we can get to and say, we've got a problem, you need to take care of it.
Does local mean within the city of Littleton or within the state of Colorado?
We could certainly define that. Normally what I've seen in other ordinances is that local would generally be within a certain number of miles of the city. You might say local might be within 20 miles of the city. Obviously, I don't view Colorado Springs as local. On the other hand, Lone Tree, I would argue Lone Tree really is local. I mean, it's adjacent to the city.
How do we do that as far as a liquor license?
And with liquor licenses, we don't look at the residence of the manager. We just simply look that there has to be a designated manager of the licensed premises, and then we have to have the contact information on how to get in touch with them.
On the premises?
On the premises, and we have to have the ability to get in touch with the licensee, even when the premises are not open or whatever. That's a condition of the license. So here, this might be a bit more stringent, the nature of it being a residential rental, but my suggestion would be that if council, based on the council direction, we could incorporate like a 20 or 25-mile radius of the city as the definition for local.
So we're not recreating the wheel here. I mean, it's out there.
It's out there. This is not a unique thing to certain types of licenses. It would be different if we were talking about maybe a license for just a retail sales tax license for a store downtown. We don't have those same kinds of concerns. When the store is closed, the store is closed. Here, this is essentially a 24/7 business. You have people renting this, and they don't suddenly go away after 8 hours. They're there the whole time. So that makes it a difference than, say, a traditional business downtown.
Karina?
Going back to the fees, and you talked about the sales tax lodging services is a criteria, is one of the elements within what falls under retail. So in this particular case, are we essentially assessing a sales tax lodging fee to this type of lodging, but not to hotels, motels, bed and breakfast, etc.? Not what this is saying?
Yeah. Well, right now, no one pays for a business license. What is in this draft would be that short-term rentals in that category would have, instead of having basically a permanent business license, they would have a one-year business license and have to pay the fee. Now, I would tell you what we do here is very unusual. I'm not aware of any other city that doesn't assess a business license fee. So the answer is, right now, no, the draft does not propose to expand that business license fee because we haven't talked with the council about that. Certainly, if the council was to say, we think you should expand it to all lodging, we would do that.
I think that, Karina, I think part of your question was, we do charge a sales tax to the hotels.
You do.
So the hotels do pay the city sales tax.
Okay.
They don't pay the lodging tax because we haven't approved. That would be an additional on top.
So
These guys.
what I'm trying to discern is what is the same for this type of lodging versus other lodging as far as fees?
The sales tax rates are identical.
The what are?
The rates are identical.
Okay, so the sales tax is
The rate would be identical.
What's additional for this particular type of lodging is a business license.
It's a business
fee
license.
that we're only charging for this business and no other business in the community.
At this point in time, this would be the only business, and the difference is, it would be an annual business license versus a permanent business license. And one of the difficulties that we have in this city is, we really don't have a functional system to revoke your business license for non-compliance, because non-compliance in terms of the sales tax code is very limited. It's basically not paying sales tax. And one of the concerns that we have here is to be able to enforce this, is making sure we have adequate tools, and that includes an annual license, because then that way, if we had problems, we could elect not to renew the license. But this is, at the end of the day, a policy question. Council was to say, we don't want a business license fee for this either, there wouldn't be one.
Peggy?
Would you define primary residence?
Primary residence is defined in this is the residence that you have identified, whether it be bank statements, driver's license, voter registration, as being your place of residence. Now, residence, from a lawyer standpoint, is kind of a very squishy term, so to speak, because residence is defined in the law as where you intend to reside indefinitely. It doesn't mean that you reside there for any more than having an indefinite intent. But for this purpose, we have defined it as a place where you might have a driver's license, voter registration, and receive tax bills, and you would have to provide those kinds of evidence to identify this as your primary residence.
Even though you might be out of town?
people.
I'm just.
Yes,
right.
it could be.
Because some people travel a
Oh,
lot.
yeah, absolutely.
I'm just clarifying.
No, it could be.
Thank you.
So this is one that I have a little bit of hesitation on as far as the need to really get good public input and community outreach, because this particular element of primary residence is very difficult to be, for those that have to comply by January 2020. This is a really hard one to comply with when we talk about parking or residency or getting a business license, etc. That makes sense. That's more operational in nature. But then this one starts kind of crossing that property rights potentially. So I think this one just warrants a lot more community outreach and understanding of what are we facing in our community and is there a risk. When I come back to what, one of the primary goals that we were trying to accomplish here is to get a good handle of the Airbnb short-term rentals that are out there, and to do that we want to ensure that they are getting their business licenses and they are complying. So I feel like this may push some of that away and make for some hardship. And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't do this. I don't think that we're ready to do this now in this short moratorium period is one of my concerns.
Yeah, this was a point I raised last time when we talked about it. I think having it be a primary residence is a bit complicated there and takes away, property rights. And say someone has, two residents, say one here and one in Nevada, and they choose to have the Nevada location or Florida as their primary residence for income tax purposes. So then they would be not allowed to rent something out in Littleton if they own a house here, even if they spend 9 months of the year here and 3 months of the year or whatever. I think something that's more along, I think the goal of this is to not have someone come in and buy an entire block of houses and then rent them all as short-term rentals. I know that's a big problem, especially in San Francisco and some other larger cities. I think perhaps a limit of one short-term rental license per individual would be a way to accomplish that. So you're not buying 10 houses and then renting them all out and changing the character of the neighborhood rather than having to be your house.
I have a question, then I have a comment. My question is the requiring the primary residence based on Golden or another place that you looked
Yes.
in?
We looked in cities across the country, all over the world. Golden, for example, requires primary residence. There are a number of other cities in Colorado that do not. This is one of those that's truly a policy choice. And Councilmember, you're right. There's a number of cities that limit the number of licenses you can have for a short-term rental. And they do that as a way of controlling this. And I would also submit to the council that I expect, if based on council action, that within a year we will be back to talk with you. If you look at Denver, again in the Denver Business News, they are finding that they did a very comprehensive ordinance, and they're finding that they have less than 50% compliance. And so Denver now is looking at, okay, we need to come back to our council and discuss where do we go from here. Now, a year ago, Denver would have said, oh, we think this is the solution, everything is going to be wonderful. And I would tell you, I expect to be back here in a year talking with you and saying, okay, we've looked at this, we've had a year's experience, we recommend these changes. Because this particular economic area is just rapidly changing in ways that it's very, very hard to predict.
And then my comment was addressing what Kyle and Karina were saying about somebody who has more than one residence. Is they don't have to rent it as a short-term rental. If they don't want to have this as their primary residence, the one here, they could rent it, of course, as a regular rental.
It's not like we're saying you can't rent your house. I like the idea of required residency because of having a close-in control of it. When you're turning over, when you're churning people coming in and out. If I had that in my neighborhood, I would want that owner very invested in what goes on there. And I wouldn't want them their mind being somewhere else permanently.
I would say someone that's renting them out, turning them over every night or every 3 nights, actually is very invested to do that because they want to keep that looking nice to rent it out. Whereas you can get a renter that's there for a whole year and the house, there's no yard maintenance or maintenance in the house.
You win.
I'm done. I'm just saying there's...
Jerry.
So, a previous attorney brought this up as this was an up-and-coming thing, and that was several years ago now. Remember that? And what brought this up today, really, is a nuisance property that we had. That took care of itself. The resident or the owner took care of that property, and I think you mentioned some other properties that are probably some issues too. It seems to me that no matter what we do, we have to have some sort of a nuisance type plan in here, regardless of what the property is. If it's a nuisance, it's a nuisance. We'd have that with rental properties now, right? Do we not?
We do have regulations generally in terms of the International Property Maintenance Code. The structure of the license here is really to address those nuisance type issues. And you're absolutely right, Mayor Pro Tem. If you look at it, we're discussing this tonight, and in the next week I was talking to the city attorney in Greenwood Village, and Greenwood Village's council is going to be also doing a study session discussing this very same issue. And this has become just one of those issues that is out there, and I think certainly the focus from a staff recommendation is that we address, as we had mentioned in the objectives, those 3 points, and that's what this is designed to do.
And the other thought I was having too is that many years ago, the city of Littleton put in a home-based business requirement for licensing, but it was sunset. But even though we had the requirement, we didn't have all these home-based businesses come knocking at the city door to get that license. And eventually it sunset, and it was like it magically disappeared as far as an issue.
And I think certainly one of the issues I know we've had in the zoning code has been the entire home-based business requirement, some of the accessory issues. Our zoning code doesn't really fit how that business environment has changed. And that's a good example of where that business environment has changed, but we haven't really addressed it. What we've tried to do here is we've looked at an awful lot of codes, and we've tried everyone from Denver to Golden to Greeley to Fort Collins, literally across this entire state, and looked at how can we address this as a start. I will again tell you, I don't think this is the end. I wish I could just tell you it was, but it's not. But I do think this gives the city a starting point for us to address this.
My last question then, as far as requiring that a property be maintained a certain way, and we have that now, I know, in most cases, business cases at least. But are we telling an owner that, hey, you cannot do this to your property, you own it? Are we doing a taking of some sort?
No, I would argue that this is not a taking, because while you have a right to use your property, do you have a right? The law requires for a taking that you have to have a reasonable expectation of being able to do something. Here, I would submit a property owner doesn't have a reasonable expectation of being able to do this without regulation. We're not saying you can't. We're simply saying you have to go through a regulatory process. And the mere fact, now regulations can be a taking if they go too far, but I would tell you these do not go too far.
Karina.
The other point that I want to make on this is that, and why this community outreach is important, and I don't think, again, within the scope that we're working in now from a time perspective and what we were trying to address in that one incident, we've been silent on this in our code for all these years, and I would even argue we've been very ambiguous about it. So there has been an unknown. Can we do it? Can't we do it? Where can we do it? Can't. So there's been already a lot of confusion and different interpretation of what our code is or is not. And so again, for that reason, I really feel we need to take the first right step to at least define this in our code, to make it known to our community that this is something that we are looking at and addressing, that we are expecting a business license in order for one of the factors being public safety, someone to contact if there's any issues, to address party houses, etc. So these are some of the reasons why that particular point of making it a primary residence, I do feel it's just going a little too far for where we are now and where we're coming from. So I would really like to strike that primary residence requirement. I do think we need to put something in to limit this buying up 10 houses and a recommendation of limiting the business license to 1. If you could come back with a recommendation with that, that's what I would like to ask for.
You got some additional questions? Comments? Kyle?
Does anyone else? I have a hefty amount here.
Based on what Karina is asking.
Oh, based on that?
Yeah.
No, I agree with that.
Carol? I disagree. Okay.
Oh, I agree. I don't want it to be primary resident.
What did you say, Jerry?
I do not want it to be the primary residence of the owner.
You don't want it to be a primary residence?
Required to be.
Requirement.
I think it should be.
I don't think it should be, but I also think maybe 1 license isn't enough, maybe allow them to 2.
Whatever the number is, but yeah.
Well, I'm kind of mixed on this. I don't have a problem with it being 1. I think that we have right now 10, and one of them became an issue and was dealt with. As has been stated repeatedly, that everybody's dealing with this city. Nobody has figured this out. It's happening to us. So we are being reactive in our response to it, which means that our response is fluid and will change. I agree. Community input is going to be important, and it will come, no doubt. And that's great from everyone, not just those who want to do Airbnbs. I find it interesting that our objectives, Objective 2 is maintain community character, Objective 3 is rules to ensure public safety. I don't know that having folks who are not considering this their primary residence at any point kind of encompasses those for me. And I do have a concern about people who are not in the community and are running a business in a neighborhood. It's one thing if you don't live here and you've hired a manager and you've got a business on Main Street or you've got a business in a shopette or something. But when you're running a business in a neighborhood, I think it's very different. And it's a 24/7. There are parking issues. There are noise issues. There are other things that are not as easy to manage in a neighborhood as you can along Main Street or in a shopette or something like that. So I think that those are concerning if someone is not within the community. I don't have a problem giving it a shot 1 year or with requiring the residency. I think that there's enough support to go beyond that at this point with the council. And given that, I would not recommend at this point that we do anything more than 1 additional business license. We just do not have this managed to the point where we can be liberal with decisions. And somebody may say, well, liberal 2 would not be that liberal. Well, I don't feel comfortable going to 1, so that for me is liberal. I think that would be something we would be able to have a better management idea of with some licensing. We have not mentioned the business license fee, so we can talk about that next. Let's make sure we wrap this up. I believe, Council, and correct me if I'm wrong, we are in consensus that to bring it back with one additional license.
Just one license. So striking out the primary residence and replacing with one license.
Maybe just clarify.
My head's at, one of theirs has to be a primary residence and they can have an additional license.
That's a completely new idea.
That's what my head was.
She's throwing it out there.
Yeah, that is.
Okay, so that's a
One
completely new
license.
idea.
Oh, okay. That's where my,
We don't want to hold ideas.
that's where my,
I think Karina, Jerry, and I were saying, you get one license, doesn't have to be your primary residence,
Oh,
or
yeah.
it can be, but you only get one.
One.
If it is your primary residence, you don't get a second one.
oh, okay, all right.
But if it's not your primary residence, say you have two houses, you can rent out the
So you
one.
can have one and it doesn't have to be your primary. We're limiting it to one.
One license
Everybody's
per
okay?
applicant.
Per applicant, and yeah, that's okay.
One license per applicant. If I apply, I get one license and that's it.
Okay. So,
And if it's a nuisance, it's a nuisance. We have ways of dealing with that.
Yes.
okay, so let's go to the business license fee. And, because there's some difference of opinion there. Karina?
I was just, I recognize that this is the first time that we're implementing a business license fee, but this is also the first time we have a business license that has a one-year annual renewal. I'm fine with this. I see this as something that we are moving towards what business licenses are going to look like for us and getting to open that discussion, so I can get comfortable with this.
And frankly, from a staff standpoint, I would submit we have some other, what I would view as heavily regulated businesses down the road, where again, having a permanent business license, we don't have the tools that we need to have to address those issues. We started here because we haven't brought those others to you, but I expect in the
So
future.
the question then is a fee. Do you support a fee for the business license?
I'd be fine with this, yes.
Okay, Carol, what?
Sure.
You bet.
Yep.
Yeah, annual.
An annual fee, and Mayor, Council, based on this, what we're asking you would be that we would begin the process of a study session at the Planning Commission, because this is part of the zoning code, and then it would go to the Planning Commission for a resolution, and then it would come back to you for a introduction at first reading.
And I just want to add one more thing to that. So on the first slide, we talked about community outreach. That will be the next piece. We did want to draft code first to put out to the community, but tomorrow we'll be outreaching to the license holders as well as putting information on Littleton plans on how people can submit comments here between now and September 18th.
And so planning, so we'll have recommendations from that. We'll have possible recommendations from planning. This will then, council, show up on a consent agenda for a first read, and then we'll move directly 2 weeks later to a public hearing.
Correct.
At which point, we will be seeing what we have approved, or what we are suggesting here, and because we did not approve anything.
Right.
And then, but we will also have recommendations to weigh into that. So if we do need to make a change, and I want to make this clear because of the moratorium,
That's where I was going to go.
that if we want to make changes at that time, we will do amendments to the recommended motion that we have. And so at that point, we will hopefully be able to pass it as amended or not, whatever that looks like, and then that will immediately end the moratorium.
That will end the moratorium. It's important just to know in the moratorium, that cannot be extended as an emergency. So if council for some reason were to say, we need to extend that, that's going to require a first and second read.
I have a question, clarification on the sales and use tax license and the fee. We don't require a sales and use tax license for hotels, or do we?
No, we do.
We do, okay, so then it's
Yes.
no different. And is there a fee associated with that?
There's no fee because they get a permanent one-time license.
So it's just different, okay.
Karina?
Your presentation, the second fee that we talked, Are we done with the business license fee? Okay. On the operator's license, you say recommended fee is 50, but in the draft ordinance, you say the annual fee for the short-term rental operator's license shall be $25. Is it 25 or 50?
Yes, it's 25.
Okay, so your presentation.
We added the two.
The intent was that is an error, it should be 25. And we set those purposely at that level because we just don't have a good enough history to be able to say to you what true cost recovery is. But certainly next year with priority-based budgeting, we will be.
Jocelyn, what are the two that you can find that you're saying?
Yeah, it's just a typo.
Okay.
So it's right.
So the total fee for a short-term rental is going to be $45 year one.
Yes.
Year two will be $20. Or no, they're both annual. So it'll be
They're both going to be
$45 every year.
Because again, with the conditional use permit, in most codes, those have to be renewed. And one of the reasons is to again be able to deal effectively with violations. And we're moving in that direction here.
Any other comments or questions?
General or?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going back to the first page of the draft ordinance. It just kind of struck me that we have bed and breakfast, hotel extended stay, and motel all defined there differently. Do we need to really differentiate between them?
We do, because right now the problem that we have, and this was one of the things, a few years back, Clarion looked at our zoning code. One of the things that they said we desperately needed to do was to have definitions that match uses. Right now in our zoning code, we have no definition for hotel. And you could argue that a hotel is in a hotel category. You can also equally argue that the hotel is in a residential category. If I could easily argue under our code that I could do an extended stay America in a residential zoning district. I really don't think that was what was intended. We're being proactive here by fixing our definitions. So our definitions for the future are not going to lead us into some of the problems that we've had in the past.
Okay, so that, I mean, I'm fine with defining differently hotel, extended stay, motel. In hotel, I've been in hotels that don't have restaurants, that don't have fitness centers, that have fewer than 100 rooms. I mean, you have a boutique hotel that's 30 rooms, no restaurant, no fitness center. So I don't see where that would necessarily fit in here then.
We'll go back and look at that, council member, because I think, again, you're right, boutique hotels have become a big, very popular thing, so we will look at that. What we're trying to just do is make sure, I mean, right now, bed and breakfast is if we actually have one come in, we're not entirely sure where we put it, because none of our definitions fit. And that's what we're trying to do, is be proactive here, because we're already dealing with one type of lodging. Let's deal with it all, so we have definitions that work.
Okay. Do you have? I was going to say, going through, and most of what I marked up was the primary residence. That definition of primary residence obviously is going to be reworked here, but it said application short-term rentals person or persons shall not include any corporation, partnership, blah, blah, blah. What about a family trust? So I know people put their house in their trust. I mean, how are we going to redefine that there with?
A trust would not be a corporation, because a trust is simply what we call in the law a beneficiary relationship. It doesn't create a new person like a corporation does. Okay. But so that would not be prohibited here.
I marked up the on short-term rental. C here, deposits and fees must be paid in advance and may be non-refundable. I don't know if we necessarily need to require them to be paid in advance. I realize that's some sort of safeguard for the rentee, but...
Quite honestly, in the definition, what we were attempting to do there was to make sure we're not over-inclusive versus, because you could get into a situation, we didn't want to basically include some kinds of short-term rentals that really weren't short-term rentals. Like perhaps you rent your house to your child and you're perfectly fine with getting the money after the fact. That isn't the intent of regulating here. And looking at the short-term rental market and looking at how that market operates, traditionally payment in advance is required and it's non-refundable. And so we were trying to keep that definition we didn't want to be overly inclusive.
Karina?
I have the same concerns Kyle has, like some of this is just so prescriptive and this is overall an industry that keeps changing, and then we find ourselves trying to say a hotel is 100 rooms versus a motel is 50. So I'm not going to repeat what Kyle said, but I have some of the same concerns. And then the follow-up to that, though, or at least my observation is when I look at the table, there have been a lot of changes here of where they're allowed, where they're permitted, where it's accessory. So I did not have enough time to look at this in a lot of detail, but I am a little concerned or want to make sure that things this is a change. This is definitely a change to our code beyond the short-term rental. The short-term rental was in addition to this, but there have been changes to some of the other definitions and uses. So I want some diligence. I want to some diligence is there for that.
And I know Jocelyn and I would be happy to sit down with any council member and talk about that. What we tried to do is, because we added new definitions, we showed all the new definitions as changed text. And we also showed we didn't attempt to somehow expand where they could be done, but because, like, a good example is bed and breakfast. It's really hard because right now you can argue that these could be done in several different districts, and so what we tried to do is stay consistent with what the code appears to be. But yes, you see all the C's and P's that are highlighted because they're not in the code right now, and that's the consequence of adding the definitions to the land use chart. Eventually, I would expect that we will have a land use chart, which all the definitions in the code will be in the land use chart.
And that was my point. I wanted to make it known that there is a change.
Absolutely.
For other categories of rooming and boarding beyond and besides short-term rentals. So that's
Absolutely.
something to pay attention to.
And I don't recall seeing it here, I was just kind of reviewing it again. How are duplexes or triplexes linked?
Duplexes and triplexes right now can be, and I believe it's the R3X and the R4 zoning districts. And now for purposes of this, a duplex would be treated, a single family attached could be a short-term rental just like a single family detached. We don't make any distinction there, but in terms of the zoning, they would be in different zoning districts, obviously.
So is one duplex, one license?
One duplex would be one license.
So they could have?
You could only have one side of the duplex.
One per space.
You know, because
one per unit.
One per individual. So in essence, if I have a duplex, I can't get two licenses. I can get one because each part of the duplex is going to be treated as a dwelling unit.
I guess then we won't have duplexes that are split ownership.
Right.
Peggy?
Yeah, so you said in the area that all kinds of stuff is happening in terms of this.
Yes.
It's just kind of volatile experience. Right?
Absolutely.
So if there's a problem with a unit, I mean, if something becomes a nuisance, a specific place becomes a nuisance, can we revoke that?
Yes, this is designed to give us that ability to revoke the license, which right now we really don't have. So this is designed to give us that.
So, but I mean, I don't mean to be unfair in revoking, but would it be complicated to revoke it?
No, I think this is designed to have a process that we would provide notice, an opportunity to be heard, and based on that, if there was sufficient grounds to revoke, we could revoke. The idea would be that to give us those tools.
Well, I guess my question is what's sufficient ground? So if somebody did X, assuming it wasn't, like they forgot to close the door, if they did something that's violating the requirement, we could just close the door and...
Well, we'd give them notice and they'd have an opportunity to be heard, but I believe it's now that we're changing this, there's like 14 requirements. If you violated any of those requirements, just like we do with other licenses, we give you notice, we tell you exactly what we think you violated, you have an opportunity to come in and be heard by an impartial person, and then based on the evidence, a decision is made to whether to revoke the license or not.
I was going to follow up on that because I was saying that it's got the failure to comply with requirements, blah, 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 revocation of license. So that's in there. What about if you don't have a license, if you're operating without a license, is there a fine set for that? Is there a misdemeanor? Where is that? Maybe not here if it's somewhere else.
In the code, if you there's a general provision that if you violate provisions of the city code or you fail to have a license, you could be actually prosecuted for a misdemeanor. What we would normally do in those cases is we basically file a complaint and we ask that you get a license. You get what's known as a deferred judgment, and after a year the case goes away, provided that you have a license. And that would be the intent here is we're not going to prosecute people criminally and have people get criminal convictions. The intent is we want you to get a license.
Unless they continue to operate.
Unless they continue. Now, if you continue to operate without a license, yes, we're going to enforce the law.
So is that like a cease and desist?
It's sort of like that. Essentially, you get summons in the municipal court, and then we would sit down with you and say, if you get a license, in a year this case goes away. If you don't get a license, well, then we can deal with you through the municipal court system.
Will the licensing authority be hearing the arguments if they...
No, because they're limited just to marijuana and liquor. So
where does it go?
The licensing would be done through community development, and then if we have a revocation, it would involve code enforcement, and then we would set it for a hearing. But normally that hearing would be done either by a hearing officer, or we could set it for a hearing within the municipal court. And it would be done by a hearing officer through the municipal court, but it would not be...
So it's the same route?
It's the same route, yeah.
Yes.
Other questions? I just have one little thing on the definition of local. I would just like, whatever that is, for there to be a clear reason as to why you want that a certain distance. So if the reason is that you want to be able to have that person within an hour's drive of this home, then you figure out what that what that number of miles is. But I would like there to be a context for that.
And that would be exactly the context, would be to have them within a reasonable time period of response. Because, as we all know, this city is not absolutely square. You could be on Bellevue and be in Englewood, or be on Bellevue and possibly be in Sheridan. Well, or be in Littleton. The goal would be to have the person within what would be a reasonable response time. And I would argue that a reasonable response time to a city request on a 24/7 matter is no more than an hour. An hour is a reasonable...
I think that just needs to be defined then.
Yes. And we can define that as what reasonably in metropolitan Denver, how far can you be within an hour? And I would submit you can't more 20
Depends on the time of day.
Yeah, so depending on the time of day, but perhaps 20 miles would be the most, depending on the time of day that you can be within an hour.
And I think to that, let's have some context. What are, if Inglewood is 30 and Denver, let's just not create a new number just for the sake of creating a new number, because as individuals are looking at this, it'd be nice to know it's local usually means within 30 miles. So
yes.
Whatever a norm may be.
And we can do that.
Okay. Any other questions?
I think we beat the hell out of that topic. Let's go.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
I second that.
All right.
And
So,
we promise we'll bring this back with the next edition of the sign code at the same time. Just kidding.
okay, city manager?
Yeah, just one comment here. I placed on the council agenda for next week a resolution supporting the reauthorization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. It's a federal program that actually, I understand our city here is actually taking advantage of. It's been a while, but the federal government is actually looking at reauthorization of this. There's a big push here within the state, CML, and others for kind of this local support. So if the council would be considering that and approve that resolution, then we'd forward it on to our state legislators. So I just want to give you kind of a heads up. It's something I did put as new on your...
And it's just support, it's not financial support.
All it is.
All it is, it's a fund by the National Park Service that uses interest in offshore oil and gas to allow for purchase and maintenance of public lands, basically.
Yeah, again, we have taken advantage of this historically. It's been a while that we have this.
And can use it again.
Correct.
So that will be on consent as a resolution?
Consent.
Okay, so that'll be in your packet. All right, any other?
I have an ask if there's any interest in this. In light of what we just had at our last council meeting, that, some of the laws and regulations that are changing around marijuana, that we, we're how many years in? Over 5 years in now. And really just to get an understanding of what is changing, how has the, what is happening in the marijuana industry, what is happening from a policy perspective. I just attended I saw a presentation on the legalization of marijuana, and they talked a lot about extracts and the dangers of extracts, and how they're also becoming a more prominent product. So I would be very interested in helping to share some of that knowledge with the rest of the council. If you guys are open to a presentation or during a study session, I don't think it's necessarily an urgent, but just to kind of see where are we with the industry and our community.
Is the goal to maybe reintroduce?
No.
Okay.
No, I think it's to be prepared of what is happening. There have things that have occurred from a regulation perspective.
On your term,
I think there are things that have occurred from a regulation perspective, not only in Colorado, but that as other states are approving it, what are they doing different that maybe they learned from us? So just to really get a landscape of the land of where it is now, the pros and cons.
Carol?
Given that we learned from Kathy, who came in, the consultant that came in and talked to us, who emphasized that our purpose and pretty much our only purpose is policy, how would learning more about marijuana influence policy?
Well, I see it as, because we do have the opportunity to implement at the local level, and we have that control, determine whether or not there's any additional policy.
Does that mean that as a city we could make laws that say you could or couldn't do in addition to what we're doing? And we would want to do that. Do we want to take that on with all of
the other stuff I
all of
agree
the
with
other
you.
things we have to do? It strikes me as a nice to do, but.
Yep, I'm with you.
Again, the reason I'm bringing it up now is we just recently approved a change last week. I was exposed to some information, and I know that the industry has changed. So I didn't say there's not a trigger that's creating urgency, but I also don't want to put ourselves in a reactive mode like we've been operating on a few instances. So just a form of education to see if we do want to take any action from them.
Peggy? Your thoughts?
Doesn't matter.
Okay, you said no.
Yeah,
Not
way
interested.
back burner.
I mean, it's fine with me, but maybe it's more one-on-one, just conversations. But I'm fine, I would support you if you want to, but.
Jerry?
We have this 3 medical, and that's where we are. This is the 4th one running, though. I think so.
Well, I think the guy down the street is selling or is closing one of the prints.
One of the Walmart isn't operating.
You're no.
I'm a no, because of our other priorities.
Right, I agree.
Wow, two things. One is this is one of those topics I just like to not talk about.
So let's not.
I understand what Karina is saying. I think that there is a value in having some update in terms of it has been 5 years. There's been a number of things that have changed. Some of the communities have had some changes going on. I'm more interested in what's happening on a local perspective. But I agree that it's not a top priority, but I think that we do have a list of study session topics, and we've got, kind of, a handful of them stacking up on there. And so I think that there's support to go ahead and put that on there, and then maybe we define better what that message is and what that looks like.
What was Peggy's? Were you a yes?
Peggy didn't care.
I don't care.
And in the meantime, as I...
Yes.
We're just going to send everybody to you if they ask us a question.
and some of this is just becoming aware of it through my children's school and activities, so it's kind of at that level that I'm getting the exposure as well. So as I become aware of opportunities, I'll just throw it out there and invite you guys along too.
Sounds
In
good.
the meantime.
Well, and we do have an annual meeting with the Littleton Public School Board, and so at that meeting, we've always had conversations with them about the types of trends that they're seeing in the schools with both drugs and alcohol, because we have to deal with that with our SROs and elsewise. So, and I think we moved that from September, and we'll probably do it sometime next year. Meet with them again next year, early.
No, we moved them last year, twice then.
Yeah.
Do you have a very quick update? We did have a study session on both the sign code and the subdivision code after the council study session with planning commission. And those are going to be coming back to you via resolution from the planning commission for introduction on first reading.
Thank you.
And finally, on any of these types of issues, like marijuana or whatever, I am always happy to do sort of a detailed memo from a legal perspective of things that are going on in the legal world that you can have as background for your benefit.
And that's what I was thinking, you were going to do that anyway.
I will be happy to talk.
Go ahead.
A detailed memo about marijuana and some of the various things that are going on from a legal perspective, because there's a great deal going on here.
Okay, that would be helpful. All right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great.
We're adjourned.